Think about the time when you just finished reading a story, maybe a classic novel or a powerful poem, and find that there are many questions resonating in your mind. Maybe you wondered why a character made a particular choice or what deeper meaning lies hidden beneath the surface of the words. You might have even seen different film or stage adaptations of the same play and noticed how each time there is a new interpretation, a different perspective. Well, if any of these thoughts have crossed your mind, then you have already begun to engage with the world of literary criticism. Before we dive in, let us first talk about the word criticism. Criticism does not just mean finding fault or being negative. In fact, our English word criticism actually comes from a very old Greek term krites, which simply means judge. You can think of the concept of criticism in this way. Even when a poet first writes their verse, they are making countless judgments about what themes to explore, which techniques to use, what their audience might or might not appreciate, and even how their work relates to the writers who came before them. So the very act of creating is in itself an act of critical thought, and this involves self-assessment, reflection, and judgment. It cannot just be pure inspiration. Consider the ancient Greek rhapsode, which was a professional performance of epic poems like Homer's Iliad or Odyssey. These works were not composed by the performers, but their performance was a deeply self-conscious and interpretive art. For example, seeing different performances of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice can completely change your understanding of a character like Shylock. He can be a domineering or vulnerable character depending on the actor and the direction of the play. In a similar way, different rhapsodes would have brought distinct effects to Homer's tales. This same thing holds true for any piece of literature, whether it is an ode by Sappho, a sonnet by Shakespeare, or a contemporary poem you read on Instagram. Each can be read or performed in various different ways, and that would yield very different meanings and impacts. In every instance, that performance is shaped by conscious choices and critical judgment. So in this broad and fundamental sense, literary criticism is a deeply human activity that goes back at least as far as archaic Greece, somewhere around 800 years before the birth of Christ. And it is an essential part of how we engage with and understand the rich diversity of literature and make it a living, evolving conversation rather than a static artifact. I hope it is established that literary criticism is not some academic activity reserved only for academic circles. It is a deep-seated human impulse which is as old as storytelling itself. Now, I think we can begin on a journey through time to trace criticism's evolution from ancient roots to the questions that still resonate today. The story of criticism truly begins in ancient Greece. It was a period around 800 years before the birth of Christ. This was the era of legendary epic poets like Homer and Hesiod and the lyrical voices of Archilochus and Sappho. Then we come to what we call the classical period, which emerged around 500 BC. This was a vibrant time that gave us great dramatists like Euripides, Aeschylus, and Sophocles. They wrote some great tragedies that are still performed and studied today. This was also the age of foundational philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, alongside the rise of rhetoric and Athenian democracy. After this, we enter the Hellenistic period, and this period saw Greek culture spread widely across the Mediterranean and Middle East. It was largely fueled by the conquests of Alexander the Great. This vast Hellenized world shared a common ruling class culture, a common literary dialect, and even a common education system. During this time, the city of Alexandria in Egypt was founded by Alexander in 331 BC. This city later became a renowned center for scholarship and letters. Imagine an enormous library and museum that hosts brilliant poets and grammarians like Callimachus and Aristarchus. We know about many of these influential figures partly thanks to the work of Suetonius. Around the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Suetonius wrote some of the very first histories of literature and criticism. The Hellenistic period concluded with the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. This was when the Roman Republic was growing ever more powerful. The Republic had annexed Egypt, which was the last part of Alexander's vast empire. Over this incredible span of nearly 1,000 years, from archaic Greece right through the Hellenistic age, poets, philosophers, rhetoricians, grammarians, and critics laid down many of the fundamental terms, ideas, and questions that would shape the future of literary criticism all the way into our present present century. There are some important concepts that you need to know about. First is mimesis, which is the imitation of the idea of art reflecting or representing reality. Then there is the nature of beauty and its connection with truth and goodness. We also have the organic unity of a literary work. This is an idea that a text should be cohesive, integrated whole, where all parts contribute to the overall effect. Then there's the social, political, and moral functions of literature, which is how literature influences and reflects society. We also have the intricate links between literature, philosophy, and rhetoric that explores their overlaps and distinctions. Then there is the nature and status of language itself, its power, its limits, and its complexities. Equally important is the concept of the impact of literary performance on an audience, that is, how a work affects its listeners or readers. Then we have the definition of figures of speech, such as metaphor, metonymy, and symbol. There is also the notion of a canon, which is this idea of a collection of the most important and influential literary works. And finally, we have the development of various genres like epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, lyric poetry, and song. This is not an exhaustive list, but as you can see, the foundations for understanding literature and its impact were laid down centuries ago. And these timeless questions continue to fuel critical inquiry even today. It is a rich legacy that we continue to build upon. This section is going to be very interesting and I have been waiting to get here. There is a truly fascinating aspect of early literary criticism that we often overlook, and that is its role as public discourse. Think of ancient Athens, which was a city bustling with art and intellect. One of the earliest recorded instances of literary criticism actually took place at the dramatic festivals of Athens. There were fierce contests in these festivals that required official judges to determine which playwright had created the best drama. Once we go deeper in this, it will show you exactly how immediate, practical, and very much a part of public life criticism was. To truly understand this public and political nature of early criticism, let us turn to a brilliant example. There cannot be anything better than Aristophanes' play The Frogs. It was first performed in 405 BC. This comedy is really remarkable because literary criticism itself is used to entertain and amuse an audience of thousands. This entire play is dedicated to debating the merits of different poets. This fact alone speaks volumes about the highly literate nature of Athenian citizens. They were expected to recognize literary allusions and understand the nuances of a critical debate and its broader political and social implications. The chorus in the play even praises the audience's intelligence by claiming that they are so sharp and keen that they will not miss a single point. The central premise of The Frogs is very inventive. There are no good poets left in the world, only what Aristophanes calls jabberers who degrade their art. So the only solution is to bring a great one back from Hades. Hades is a prominent figure in Greek mythology who is the king of the underworld. To decide which dead tragedian out of Euripides or Aeschylus is most suitable for this task, a trial is held before Hades. The judge, of course, is Dionysus, who is the patron god of drama. Aristophanes comically portrays Dionysus' adventures as he makes his way to the court and listens to the arguments presented by each poet. On the surface, it would seem like a simple contest between older and younger generations, but it actually dives very deep into poetic art itself. Aeschylus represents the more traditional virtues of an older generation. He champions martial power, heroism, and respect for social hierarchy. And he conveys all this in a sublime style of speech. He argues that poets like Orpheus taught humanity religious rites and moral codes, and Homer sang of valor and war. Aeschylus sees himself in this tradition and reminds the audience how his own dramas inspired manly passions for war. He firmly believes that we, the poets, are teachers of men, and that a sacred poet should avoid depicting evil. Euripides, on the other hand, is the voice of a more recent, democratic, and plain-speaking generation. So while he argues that poets are valued for their ready wit and wise counsels and training citizens to be better townspeople, he claims to use a democratic approach. This means allowing characters from all social classes to speak. In this way, he shows scenes of common life and teaches the public to reason. He insists that poets should speak in an everyday language and even accuses Aeschylus of using language that is bombastic, flamboyant, obscure, and repetitive. Aeschylus counters that a high style is fitting for mighty thoughts and heroic aims, and he criticizes Euripides for teaching the youth to prate and harangue to debate, and bringing debauchery to the stage. Finally, in a famous comic scene, a pair of scales is brought in, and Aeschylus's verse is found to be weightier. But this is where it gets interesting. There are actually two factors involved in deciding which one to select among Euripides and Aeschylus. Dionysius explains that not only does Athens need a true poet who will enable her to continue with her dramatic festivals and choral games, but this poet will be called upon to give the city some much needed advice on a political problem. The political problem that Athens was facing at this time was what should be done about Alcibiades. Alcibiades was a brilliant but selfish and indulgent general in exile who had been a threat to the state and the democracy of Athens. Aeschylus offers advice similar to that given by the statesman Pericles at the beginning of the war, that Athens' true wealth lies in her fleet. Dionysius then declares Aeschylus the victor, and the chorus praises him as a keen, intelligent mind. This phrase is interesting because the keen, intelligent from Aeschylus is actually seen as the opposite of what the philosopher Socrates was known for, particularly with regards to his way of talking, which some found to be just clever, meaningless chatter and tricky arguments. This subtle jab at Socrates foreshadows a major theme we will explore later. And that theme is of the recurring quarrel between poetry and philosophy in the history of literary criticism. Aristophanes' The Frogs powerfully embodies and enacts the civic duty of poetry and literary criticism. In fact, the play was so highly regarded that it was performed a second time, which was a unique honor then, because Aeschylus was seen as having performed an important patriotic service to the city. His play urged Athenians who were facing military defeat to return to the martial and manly values represented by Aeschylean drama. It truly staged Athens' political and cultural dilemma as a literary critical one. This first recorded instance of a sustained literary critical debate reveals something crucial about ancient Greek views on poetry and criticism. For the ancient Greeks, our modern, sometimes narrow focus on the purely aesthetic or literary dimension of a text would have been incomprehensible. Poetry for them was a vital part of the educational process. Its influence stretched across morality, religion, and the entire sphere of civic responsibility. So, as such, poetry itself served as a forum for the discussion of larger issues. It earned its high esteem from its public and political nature as well as its artistic qualities. These various dimensions of poetry were not as separated as they sometimes appear for us today. So, to truly understand the origins and nature of literary criticism in the Greek world, especially in the works of Plato and Aristotle, we need to consider the political, social, and intellectual forces that shaped their understanding of the world. Now that we have discussed how public and central literary criticism was in ancient Athens, let us now consider some deeper influences that truly shaped the critical lens of early Greek thinkers. These forces actively molded how people understood literature, its purpose, and its power. First and foremost, there is the influence of the polis or the city-state on Greek thought. For the Greeks, the polis was everything. It was the center of political, social, and spiritual life. Aristotle famously called humans political animals. What he meant was that our very nature is tied to living in a community. In this world, literature, religion, and culture was never seen as private matters. They were always public concerns that are integral to the well-being and identity of the entire community. Think about the chorus in Greek drama. You might think of them as a group of performers, but it literally represented the voice and perspective of the community. Again, what we see here is the deeply public and educational role of poetry, which almost functioned as an early form of mass media. It spread ideas, values, and shared narratives to a wider audience. Against this backdrop, there was a huge historical event that also cast a long shadow. It was the Peloponnesian War. This was a brutal 27-year conflict between democratic Athens and oligarchic Sparta. More than just a military struggle, it was an ideological clash which pitted two vastly different ways of life against each other. This devastating war deeply influenced many thinkers of the time, including Plato, who witnessed witnessed Athens' defeat and decline. As we will see in subsequent videos, his philosophical and literary theories often reflect a skepticism towards democracy and an anti-democratic sentiment that stemmed from the chaos and instability he observed during and after this period. Out of this era also came the concept of Pan-Hellenism. This refers to the development of shared literary ideals and a sense of common Greek identity across the many independent city-states. As Greek culture spread, particularly with the conquests of Alexander the Great, there was a growing desire for common cultural touchstones. This drive led to the continuous modification and diffusion of popular Homeric poems. So what does that mean? It means the epic tales of Homer that were initially passed down orally and perhaps varying from region to region began to be written down and standardized. This text fixation, or making texts more stable and uniform, was a crucial development. With this standardization, the role of the poet shifted. The poet became seen as a guiding voice of truth. They were someone whose work moved beyond merely local myths to convey universal truth or aletheia. The muse, the divine inspiration for poetry, was now understood to connect the poet's mind with what really happens, with a deeper, more profound reality. This elevated status of poetry, which claims a domain of universal truth, directly sets the stage for the contention between poetry and philosophy, and which of them truly holds the key to knowledge and truth. The push for Pan-Hellenism also naturally led to the idea of a canon. It was a collection of classic authoritative texts which were deemed most important and exemplary. It was through criticism or thoughtful judgment that works were selected for inclusion in this growing body of revered literature. The concept of mimesis or imitation also evolved and took on a new layer of authority. It no longer just meant imitation in a general sense. It now signified the authoritative reenactment of myth, and it carried an implicit promise of exact and faithful performance. This emphasized the authority of universal truth over mere local variations in storytelling. The increasing authority of poetry, now fixed in a canon and delivering universal truths, becomes an incredible crucial backdrop for Plato's later critiques. Finally, by Plato's time, theatre, especially tragedy, had become the primary and most influential medium for poetry. It absorbed and transformed elements from older epic and lyric forms and became the dominant artistic force that captivated and educated the Athenian population. Understanding this influence of theatre helps us appreciate the scale of what Plato was confronting when he began to critically examine poetry. So far, we have seen the deep roots of literary criticism and the cultural forces that shaped ancient Greek thought. Now, let us bring all these threads together to truly set the stage for Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle are the two towering figures whose ideas would forever change the course of literary theory and criticism. By Plato's time, poetry held an almost unrivaled status in Greek society. It became a source of collective wisdom, the repository of universal myths, and fulfilled roles that today are covered by fields like theology, history, mass media, and formal education. Epic poems were like the textbooks, plays were the news and moral lessons, and myths explained the universe. This authority of poetry and its power to shape minds and morals was precisely the formidable force that Plato confronted in his philosophical inquiries. Into this intellectual landscape emerged two significant currents: sophistic thought and rhetoric. Figures like Protagoras and Gorgias were the sophists. They were traveling teachers who offered a general education and often took high fees. They used to teach young men how to succeed in political life by mastering public speaking and argumentation. Their lessons often touched on morality and truth, but their approach was often pragmatic and sometimes relativistic. It suggested that truth could be subjective or depend on perspective. This leads us to rhetoric, which is the art of persuasive public speaking. It was absolutely vital in Athenian democracy, where citizens often debated laws and policies in public assemblies and argued cases in court. But Plato viewed these developments with a deep suspicion. He saw the sophists' accounts of truth as secular and relativistic, as a rejection of any higher transcendent truth. He believed rhetoric was not about uncovering truth, but merely about winning arguments through persuasion, often by preying on the ignorance or emotions of the audience. He felt that rhetoric could make false ideas seem plausible, manipulating rather than enlightening. We can draw a parallel here to our modern democracies. Think about how often truth in a courtroom or a political debate can seem less about an absolute fact and more about which version of events is presented more persuasively or appears more probable. Plato's concerns about rhetoric's potential to obscure genuine truth are in many ways still strikingly relevant today. Plato's entire philosophical system, with its famous dialectical method, was generated largely in opposition to these relativistic views. He sought to ground morality, politics, and religion not in shifting opinions or clever arguments, but in timeless and universal truths that could be discovered through rigorous reason. Crucially, Plato extended his critique to poetry, particularly to tragedy. He viewed poetry as a form of rhetoric. He believed that tragic drama, much like public speaking, used emotional appeal and captivating narratives to make particular moral views appear attractive to the ignorant and irrational audience. For Plato, tragic dramas played a significant and potentially dangerous role in citizens' education. He addressed precisely the kinds of issues that he explored in his philosophical dialogues. The poetic vision that Plato challenged was in many ways the Homeric one. The Homeric world was often ruled by chance, inhabited by quarreling gods who intervened unpredictably and driven by processes that seemed to lack inherent order or justice. It was a world of myth and divine whim. This contrasted sharply with the rise of rational inquiry, spearheaded by thinkers like Socrates and Plato. They were indebted to earlier pre-Socratic naturalism, which had begun to seek rational, systematic explanations for the universe rather than relying solely on poetic or mythical accounts. These philosophers made a fundamental distinction between mere sensory appearance and an underlying appearance. Sensory appearance is what our eyes and ears perceive, and an underlying appearance is the true reality which could only be accessed through reason and intellect. They believed that while poetry might offer beautiful appearances, philosophy offered a path to ultimate reality. So the stage was definitely set. Greek philosophy, particularly Plato's, began as a direct, powerful challenge to the monopoly of poetry and its extensions in sophistic thought and rhetoric. This intellectual confrontation was not a minor skirmish, it was a foundational clash over the nature of truth and knowledge. In doing so, Plato inadvertently set the stage for more than 2000 years of literary theory and criticism. He sparked a conversation about art's purpose, its power, and its relationship to truth that continues to this very day. In the next few videos of this series, we will go deeper into how Plato and Aristotle grappled with these big questions. So that was all I had for you in this video. I have tried from my side to simplify it as much as I can. If there is any issue in understanding any of the concepts, feel free to drop your concerns in the comment section. I will reply as soon as I can. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, keep reading and keep learning.